Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion topic. This week's topic, as you can see from the title, is going to be all about the water tribes. Specifically, the topic I was asked to talk about was the relationship between the two tribes, the North and the South, and basically what's the explanation behind all the kind of changes in leadership, the way at certain points the South and North have separate chiefs, at certain points they don't. How does the Republic City Council play into this, and so on. It's a really confusing topic, and I feel I can't talk about this necessarily in the same way as other topics, purely because I think a lot of this video is just going to be me stating the facts. I can't really add a lot because a lot of it would just be flat out speculation, when there are just a lot of kind of little moments that we just don't know about. I think North and South will fill in a lot of the gaps in terms of explaining a few things, as I'll get into. But right now, all we really know is okay, we know a little bit from ATLA, we know a little bit post ATLA, we know Sokka at some point, was the Southern Water Tribe chief, and then much later on, we know Unalaq is the chief of both tribes. So let's get into this, and let's start with the origins of the Water Tribe. Where does it come from? Like most of the origin stories for the nations, we don't know a lot about the extreme early origins of the Water Tribes. We obviously know that there were a group of people who were on the backs of at least one water lion turtle. And we assume the same deal that Wan's people had with the fire lion turtle, the early water tribe people had with this water lion turtle, where they'd be allowed to take the element of water, go out, hunt for food, whatever, leave the lion turtle, come back, give the lion turtle back the bending. And we assume that because of what Wan did, being the first one to really break off with bending and inspiring his own group of people to do that, and then obviously when he becomes the Avatar, the era of the lion turtles ends, they leave, and so the implication is that the same thing that happened with Jaya leading Wan's people out, is that just before the lion turtles left, they probably said, look, we're leaving, no humans are allowed to stay on our backs anymore, you have to go and live yourselves now, the spirits aren't here anymore. Before I leave, I will offer you can take bending if you want and keep it, you don't have to give it back, and it's just a thing, you can have it if you want. And we assume a lot of people took that. There are probably some people who didn't, but again, we're not really sure exactly. We probably assume that roughly not everyone did, and so that's why there are non-benders, and every human is not a bender, in that there are certain lines of people that just don't have bending anywhere in their lineage. But yeah, so that's the kind of super early, relating to beginnings, in that effectively, it's kind of more or less that the Fire Nation and the Air Nomads are effectively the first two, proper cultures in terms of forming into what they actually were, because the Air Nomads obviously were basically allowed to keep their bending non-stop because they tried to actually be peaceful with the water, with the spirit. Even some spirits were allowed to live on top of the air lion turtle, so that's a little bit of a different scenario. And then obviously the big key incident leading to the formation of the Avatar and the start of a new era without the lion turtles is because of basically the early Fire Nation. So the Water and Earth nations, their origins are kind of a little bit more vague, and we assume that roughly the same thing happened with both. It's just that the lion turtles left, people were allowed to choose to take bending or not, and then we just assume that gradually over time the people from the water lion turtles settled in or around the north. I would have liked it a little bit better if during the montage of Wan getting the elements, they had made it very clear that he got water bending from the water lion turtle towards the north of the world. They don't especially make that clear, but it probably is the case. And obviously the lion turtle left, they settled down and built their tribe towards the north of the world. And so, as we know from Avatar history, the water tribes initially started as just the northern tribe. The southern tribe was formed later, I'll get into that, and then the Foggy Swamp tribe after that. But initially, the water tribes start off with just northern tribe. From there, it's hard to know because we skip ahead a good, 40, 50 years, and humans are at war. There's no spirits in the world anymore. Juan has sent them back to the spirit world, and suddenly humanity is at war. The Water Tribe is fighting with the Fire Nation and is fighting with the Earth Kingdom. It's a three-way war. The Air Nomads, as far as we're aware, aren't involved in this battle. Juan is very old and dies in the middle of this battle, as we see in Beginnings, and the Avatar cycle continues, and as far as we are aware, the way this war ends is that, we assume that because the Earth Kingdom is the greatest landmass in the Avatar world, the Earth Kingdom wins that war, and so the losing nations, the Water and Fire Nations, retreat to their respective kind of points of origin. For the Fire Nation, of course, it's the various Fire Islands, which links into the early Fire Nation history, and then for the Water Tribe, their place of origin is, of course, the kind of northern parts of the world, the kind of northern islands, North Pole area. And we assume from there that is effectively how the world as we know it is more or less established, in terms of the Earth Kingdom having most of the main middle landmass, the Fire Nation occupying most of the land, the islands on the sides of the world, and then the Water Tribes getting the north, and then the south forms later on. Obviously, much before this, we don't know exactly when the Tuyen Law, the Ocean and Moon Spirit, switch in from the spirit world to the physical world, and basically live in a spirit pool somewhere in or around where the Northern Water Tribe would be. It's mentioned that happens towards the beginning, whatever the beginning means, whether that be it's like the beginning of the era of the Avatar, is that the beginning of Earth, beginning of the universe, or what? We're not entirely sure, but probably the spirit pool, Tuyen Law, probably predates humanity, at the very least predate the Avatar, absolutely. And obviously, I assume that's part of why the Water Tribe then formed in many ways around the North Pole, because of that spirit pool, and that's why the spirit pool is effectively only known to the royalty of the Northern Water Tribe. That's why Arnook and Yue knew about it. So that's a interesting just thing in and of itself there. That's realistically how that kind of came into being. Now you may be wondering, in or around when do the people of the Water Tribe, early Water Tribe, go from just having the ability to bend water to actually proper bending discipline, the way we know water bending as it is, push and pull, stuff like that. All we know is that at some point the waterbenders realized the connection between water and the moon and ocean, the push and pull, and incorporate that into their own style of waterbending, and that's how they begin to properly bend their element, in the same way that Juan obviously was the first proper firebender, learning from the dragons, and obviously we know of similar people in the Earth Kingdom learning from the Badger Moles. The same thing happens with the Water Tribe people, but we don't know the names of these people necessarily. So there we go. So after that, it's kind of hard to fill in so much time, because effectively we skip over basically everything until ATLA, the start of the 100-Year War. But at some point before this, obviously, the Southern Water Tribe does form. We don't know when, we don't know how early it was or whatever. All we know is that at some point people just kind of started to leave the Northern Water Tribe because they disagreed with a lot of the stuff that was going on there. This is when obviously a lot of the heavy traditional aspects of the North would start to come into play. The people who weren't very much into that left, and formed their own, tribe in the south. And so the south has its origins as a kind of somewhat rebel faction by default, and so that's where the south comes into play. So it's actually really interesting that I think a lot of people may just assume that, there were always just two tribes, but it actually did start with just the north. Then the south came into play and kind of had a less strict form of kind of traditions and that sort of thing. In the main one obviously being the whole marriage thing, and that it's arranged marriages with betrothal necklaces in the north, though they still use the tradition of the betrothal necklace in the south, but it's more like you're allowed to choose your own partner, I suppose. Though they still have traditions, of course, the whole 14-year-old thing, the ice dodging, but again, not as strict. The rules about like women can't be fighter benders, they can only be healers, isn't really done in the south. How the Foggy Swamp tribe forms is, it's effectively the same thing in that people break out from kind of both tribes, the south and the north, and just gradually form a new tribe in the swamp. Like we really don't have a lot of information about how the Foggy Swamp tribe really properly forms, so it's a hard one to really talk too heavily about, because like the only reason we really know that is because of like one little tiny piece of trivia, like from the original Avatar: The Last Airbender website. It's just that the people who originally went to the south, I think I misspoke earlier on, the Foggy Swamp tribe is basically made up from people originally from the south, not the north. So it's it's a further kind of separating of the people who originally come from the north, which is actually very interesting that it's just Southern Water Tribe people, and then obviously they form a very different side of Water Tribe culture, being obviously in the Earth Kingdom but still being waterbenders, different style. You can very much look to them as kind of the original people who saw, I suppose, what would eventually become the main concept behind bloodbending. Using plants, bending plants and that sort of thing is definitely the first step towards bloodbending in terms of bending water within a living thing to control it. It's just until Hama, no one actually thought to actually put that into practice until her. Yeah, that's really the basic kind of origin of the water tribes. And then you eventually get to the 100-Year War, and obviously the key events in Water Tribe history that happen here are that the North is effectively impenetrable by the Fire Nation, because there's such a huge ice field effectively just in front of the North Pole, between the tip of the northern Earth Kingdom and the North Pole. As we saw with Zhao, the whole problem with them getting there in ATLA, there's just this massive ice field in front of it, and it makes it a very good defensive position for them. Not so much with the South. They don't quite go into much depth, but it's basically established that the South isn't as well protected a location as the North Pole. And so after the Air Nomad genocide, obviously Sozin thought that, okay, I can't find the Avatar from the remaining airbenders, so let's just assume that the cycle has continued and the next Avatar is a waterbender, so let's destroy the Southern Water Tribe because we can't get near the Northern Water Tribe. And so that's why it eventually, Zulon is the one, I think, who orders the attack on the Southern Water Tribe, which obviously results in most of, if basically all but one really of the Southern Waterbenders really being captured, and that's how Hama gets captured, and that whole thing happens, and so on. Eventually, other attacks are ordered, and so on. The attack with Kaya from the Southern Raiders, just because they didn't fully annihilate the Southern Water Tribe, but you see this idea of the Fire Nation gradually thinking they've eliminated the Avatar as an airbender, and just basically covering all bases by trying to eliminate the Avatar if he has been reborn into the next element in the cycle. and just the general confusion about what exactly happened. That in general, like it is the case that the fire sages, who are like the spiritual advisors of the Fire Lord, basically were loyal to him, and the Fire Nation in general wasn't as spiritual anymore. They obviously were still spiritual somewhat, but not really fully being able to know what nation the Avatar is born into currently is a key problem for them during all of that. And obviously it's basically during this point that relationship between the North and the South is effectively stopped. We basically have no knowledge about what the relationship was between them, full stop, anyway. Like, obviously knowing that the South was formed from the North, and the fact that like no one really knew about the Foggy Swamp tribe, you get this idea that a lot of the different separate water tribes weren't in much contact with each other anyway. But there's definitely somewhat of an implication that after a while the North and South did begin to communicate once again, and fundamentally they're still both considered the water tribes. They're just made up of two separate locations that are still quite similar. So we assume a friendship did form, but because of obviously the difference in defensibility of the two places and the whole war happening, they just completely lost track. And as far as the North was aware, the whole South was effectively wiped out, and there was nothing they could really do. They just had to protect their own land. So that's more or less all we really know until Avatar: The Last Airbender happens, and obviously, like, Katara and co go there, and we find out about all the cultural stuff happening there, the key change that Katara like forces to happen there. But beyond that, it is one of those situations where we really don't know that much. The key setup in ATLA is that it is established that they haven't been in contact with the Northern Tribe in a long time, and them going there is basically them rediscovering the place, and it's the North rediscovering that the South still has benders and is still effectively alive as a nation. Now, as for the leadership, I think is part of the question that I'm answering here, both of them have tribal chiefs. Their full stop is a chief of the Northern Water Tribe, and there kind of always has been, and still is, basically. The South eventually got their own chief, obviously, when they formed their own tribe. We really don't know how the leadership of the Foggy Swamp tribe works. We assume that Hugh is the leader, but he's more of a spiritual leader. I don't think they really have any sort of structure to their tribe. It's just that the people are the people, and they tend to look up to the more spiritually enlightened people like Hugh, who is just he himself, you wonder, is he even part of the tribe? But he is basically just barely part of the tribe. But yeah, you have the tribal chiefs, and this changes a lot. This is one of the main things we don't know a lot about, in that obviously when they go to the North, Chief Arnook is the leader of the Northern Tribe, and he has a daughter who is a princess. But Hakoda is the de facto Southern Water Tribe chief, but his daughter and son are not prince and princess, or princess and prince, the way I said it. That's probably one of the most interesting things, and that comes down to, I think, just the difference in tradition values between the two tribes. That the North are like, no, we have a royal family, we have royalty, we call our next in line a princess, whereas in the South it's more like, no, the person that we think is the best leader is going to be our leader. He's going to be our chief. His family is going to be respected because of that, but it's not a default thing where just the chief's son becomes the next chief. It's probably more than likely going to happen because the chief would raise his son or daughter well to be the next good leader, but it's not a kind of built-in thing. I think that's the best way to describe the difference in kind of structure of the leadership of both tribes, in that one is very much similar to the Fire Nation, they have a royal family. The other one is more like, no, the people elect who they want, and there's a need for obviously a leader of a country or a nation, and they do that for that reason. And obviously there's a lot more freedom in the south than there is in the north. As I said, we don't know anything about the leadership of the Foggy Swamp tribe, really. So there's that. Now, the key thing that happens in ATLA is obviously that Katara sort of changes the north and helps them to not be so set in their ways, and that it's sort of established that they loosen their utter belief, and you have to stick to the rules. And I think the main thing would just be that probably arranged marriages are probably still a thing up there, but they're not as regular anymore. The main example you can see of that is the fact that Eska is, as far as she's aware, is allowed to choose her own boyfriend and so on, with Bolin and stuff like that. There's no hint whatsoever that she has an arranged marriage. So that clearly is something that changes because of Katara and Aang's going up to the north. But what happens there is that to reconnect the tribes, Palku brings a bunch of people from the north down to the south. He marries Katara and Sokka's grandmother, who is Hakoda's mother. And it's established that they're going to help rebuild the Southern Water Tribe, which, as far as we're aware from ATLA, is just one really small village that basically has no buildings. Now, this is basically where, coming back to the North and South comic comes into play, in that we haven't been back there since. We've seen rough hints at kind of what's going on there, but in general, we haven't been back to the Water Tribe since the end of Book 1 of Avatar. So we don't know what's happened in the south at all. We now know from basically the previews for North and South and stuff like that, that okay, we are going to arrive back there and see a much more built up Southern Water Tribe. Hakoda is still going to be in charge, but there's going to be some sense of northern control over the south. And that's probably what the conflict around North and South is going to be. It's this idea that the North helped the South. We deserve to have some sense of leadership in how we also want a say in how the South is ruled, because we helped you from nothing. You wouldn't have any of this if it wasn't for us, the Northerners. And it's probably going to be this case of no, we just wanted to change things. What are you trying to do here? So I assume we're going to come out of North and South with a key change in how the Southern Water Tribe kind of operates politically. That I assume either Hakoda is still going to be chief, or Sokka will be made chief in North and South at the end, or it will be very much set up that shortly Sokka will be becoming the chief. Because we know, for a fact, one of the only things we know about Sokka in between now and whenever he dies is that he is the chief of the Southern Water Tribe at some point. And he's old enough now to become the chief, I think. He showed how strong he was as a leader during ATLA. I think it would be a natural thing to happen. But it's hard to know what exactly North and South is really going to be about, what it's really going to delve into, because the key thing that happens between ATLA and Korra is that something happens and suddenly the role of Northern Water Tribe chief actually becomes chief of both tribes, in that Tonraq is only the Southern Water Tribe chief as of a couple of episodes into Book 2. Unalaq is the chief of the Southern and Northern Water Tribes up until the Southern Rebellion and them going independent. So that's a really important note to make. Is that what North and South is going to do? Is that going to be the story where we see the position of Southern Water Tribe chief switch? But again, that can't happen right just then, because we know Sokka is the Southern Water Tribe chief, at least for a while. So my take on it is that when Sokka dies, which could be related, he could have died defending Korra from the Red Lotus, and that being a plan put into action by Unalaq could just say okay, look, the Southern Water Chief has just been killed, you don't have an obvious successor, I'm going to take over as the chief of both tribes. But what gives him the right to do that? Something has to happen that forces that to happen. Now, that may be another reason why Unalaq and Tonrock have such issues between each other when we start Book 2, in that Unalaq could have done something where, even before he took over in Book 2, he had this key moment where he said, I'm declaring myself chief of this tribe. That we've let you have your own chief for a while now, but I am now enacting my rule as the leader of the main tribe and taking over your tribe, or something like that. Something has to happen, because otherwise we have this weird continuity thing where we have a story that is going to explore to some extent the leadership of the Southern Water Tribe, but we know a fact about a character that kind of contradicts that. Sokka being the Southern Water Tribe chief is a big thing. And now it also, I think, has to link into the fact that at some point Sokka also becomes the what am I trying to say here? Sokka also is the Southern Water Tribe representative on the on the Republic City Council. So I assume that's a position he takes up after he potentially steps down as chief of the South. But it's again another confusing thing, because if Unalaq takes over as the tribal chief of both tribes, could he not also say that, okay, the Southern Water Tribe doesn't get a representative on the Republic City Council anymore? Or is the Republic City Council just completely separate than all world leaders? We really, really don't know. There's a lot of confusion about this stuff, as you see I'm getting into. So let's from there move into, I suppose, Korra time. The only key event that we really know about is that Tonrock and Unalaq's father is the chief of the Northern Water Tribe. I don't think we're fully sure if the position at that point is both tribes, but I'm not really sure. But anyway, he's the chief. Tonrock is very much set up to be the next chief. Unalaq is jealous, and he obviously engineers the situation with the barbarians that attack, that forces Tonrock to attack back, and obviously the barbarians take the fight into the sacred forest around the spirit portal. Tonrock attacks, destroys the forest. Spirits are angry at him. Unalaq can quell the spirits. He is then given the right to be the next chief when the father shortly then passes away. Unalaq takes the position that his brother was going to get, and Tonrock is banished to the south. He becomes somewhat of a leader in the south, but he is not, as I said, he's not the Southern Water Tribe chief until the events of Book 2. Obviously, at some point, Unalaq does something either where it's already the case at this point where the Northern Water Tribe chief is the chief of both tribes, or does something to make that the case. We don't know. Yeah, so that's what happens. Unalaq then enacts his kind of plan during Korra. He basically proves himself to be the villain, and this causes a rebellion of the south against the north, because Unalaq makes his move to try and kind of like force the south to be more spiritual. Obviously, all as part of a major plan to get Korra to open both spirit portals to free Vaatu and enact the overall plan of the Red Lotus. But it doesn't work. He ends up getting killed by Korra, as is what happens in Book 2. At this time, the South elects Tonrock as their chief. He remains the chief throughout all of Korra, and as far as we are aware, is still the chief. And that's the situation that we have right now. Eska and Desna become the co-chiefs of the Northern Water Tribes, and we assume they're fairly happy with the North and South being separate entities. And that's where we leave it. That's all we know basically up to now. There's been no shifts in anything. But I will get back to that point in a minute. I think I've got one or two more little things to cover. The final thing I really wanted to mention was just relating to the Northern Water Tribe, we obviously know that UA turned into the moon, so as far as we were aware, that was kind of Arnook's kind of line kind of ended in terms of the Northern Water Tribe royalty. So like, what happened after that? Like, who was the tribe? Who was the chieftain after Arnook? That's where I assume the North also has somewhat of the same system that the South has, where like if their royal family is about to end, they can elect, I suppose, a new person, and that person's family becomes the royal family, because otherwise that sort of suggests that Tonrock and Unalaq are somehow distantly related to Arnook, to UA, and there's a connection there, which would mean that Korra is somehow really distantly related to UA and Arnook as well, but we don't really know. And I think ultimately that's the kind of key takeaway from like this entire video. It's just that there are a few key things where we are just not informed about what exactly happened. Like, we are just introduced to Unalaq as the chief of both tribes without any explanation as to why that has happened. The only assumption we can really make is that, okay, the South helped rebuild the North, so there's probably some sense of like he used that to get both titles. But in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on the water tribes, how they're governed, their relationship between both tribes, which is pretty good right now, because obviously it's basically the same family running both the North and the South, just kind of different sides of things, and like they're not a conflict anymore, so that's good. But also in the comments, let me know what you want the next discussion topic to be. But other than that, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.